Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is joining us for a second round. It's Bob Layton. Bob, welcome to Comic Culture.
Hey, Professor, how you doing? Thanks for having me back.
So when last we spoke, we talked about your writing and art career, and we ran out of time just as we started to talk about your career as an editor for Valiant Comics. So I wanted to just see if we could pick up where we left off, which is how you went from being the star writer artist to becoming the editor-in-chief of Valiant Comics in the 1990s.
I think it's really funny that we spoke for a half hour and only got as far as the first 10 years of my career. Yeah, I was busy. Actually, I'll tell you a really interesting story. It came down. There was a great inker that used to work at Marvel in DC whose name was Jack Abel. I worked with him up at Continuity when I was an apprentice, and he worked at both companies. He was an old school guy, you know what I mean, like a Silver Age guy. And Jack had a stroke about 13 years into my career at Marvel, and he recovered, bless his heart, but he lost the use of his drawing arm. And Marvel, at that time, Marvel was, I guess, still had a heart. They gave him a job as a proofreader, so he could still work and stuff like that. But I remember Jack sat in the corner, and because in his brain he was still as good an artist as he ever was, but he just couldn't get his body to do what it wanted anymore. And it really got me thinking about, is this the end fate to all comic artists? Do we just wind up, doing the same stuff until our body fails? And it made me really start thinking about being more than a wage slave in the business. That I needed to look for opportunities where I could actually be management, where I could actually control my fate, where I owned what I created, or whatever. And so when the Valiant was just starting up, I had been on contract with Marvel for about 10, 12 years. And that was a pretty steady gig, with health insurance, all that stuff. They asked me to come over and help create the line there, because I'd always been an idea guy. I was always the guy somebody would come to and say, hey, I'm kind of stuck here. You got any ideas of how I can do this or that? And my mind just kind of works that way. Not everything I come up with is great, but I'm a guy that's full of ideas. So all those things converged. Those feelings, the Valiant starting up, getting the money to start up, and so everybody thought I was nuts. But I notified Marvel that I was leaving. And I was living in Colorado at the time. And I moved to New York City, back to New York, and started on the ground floor.
What you're saying is you sort of had that editor's mindset, even as just a writer, not just as a writer-artist, but people would come to you and you'd be able to give them that guidance. And I think from what I've learned that's sort of what an editor does in comics.
Well, they did. I don't think that's necessarily the case today, but back then, I don't know if I told you the story, like with Archie Goodwin. I was working later on after Valiant. I went back to freelancing for a while, and I remember I was working on a Batman story with Dick Giordano, my mentor, and I turned in a plot, and Archie Goodwin was there, and he read the plot, and he wrote 2 lines on the top of the border that just changed the whole thing and made it just like 100% better, because Archie Goodwin was one of the greatest writers that, in the history of comics, in my opinion. And he read the thing and he automatically knew how it could be improved. And that's kind of a job. That's what a showrunner does in Hollywood. Is a showrunner basically controls the entire process, and he works with various writers, but he makes sure that there's a consistency and stuff. And I took that showrunner attitude and brought it into Valiant. My idea was that I was going to create properties, find the teams, the writers, the pencilers, the inkers, or whatever, and put them together and guide them to execute a vision that I had, you know, and that was kind of the way it started there. Because, you know, I think in any creative process, somebody has to have a vision. Somebody has to see what the big picture is, you know. And for me, I obviously I couldn't create an entire line of books single-handed. I mean, that's just not going to happen, right? So, but that process allowed me to police the entire universe, you know, but basically come up with concepts that fit one another. So Valiant, that's why Valiant became a very cohesive universe, you know, and it is, let's say, very character-driven, cohesive universe where everything kind of tied together nice and neatly.
When it's time for you to reach out to the writers and artists to put together those teams, I'm imagining because you had that career at Marvel, it makes it easier for you to get people to come on board. But could you kind of talk a little bit about that process? Because I'm imagining, even though it's the 90s and the comics industry is booming, it's still a little scary to go on to that new publisher.
Well, when we started, Valiant started in 89, you know, and like I said, unfortunately, they took a couple of missteps. Because the people that were higher up than me had decided that they were going to pursue the license for Nintendo and the WWF. And so they thought both lucrative franchises, but I was against it because I really didn't feel like this was a target audience for comic books. The boom in the industry hadn't quite started yet, you know, so and, you know, that basically, we spent a year and a half, maybe 2 years, pissing away most of the money, investment money, on books you couldn't give away. You know, and it was out of desperation that, because we had to license the Gold Key characters, it was almost like a last resort. We had to get more venture capital and basically get going with the superhero launch immediately. So we had Magnus and Solar that we had licensed from a Gold Key because Steve Mazarski had a relationship with those people. So we basically had a very lucrative license in the sense that we didn't pay much for it, and yet we had a full reign to redesign those characters and redevelop those characters any way we saw fit. And we used that as the groundwork to create a whole new universe. It started with those two characters, and then we snowballed into the new stuff like Exo Man of War and Shadow Man and so forth and so on. The speculator boom hadn't quite started when we did. I think our first book, even though Magnus and Solar sold well, it wasn't until Exo Man of War where we started getting like crazy numbers, you know. But again, it was me doing a character in armor again. Plus, I brought Barry Windsor-Smith over from Marvel, which was no small feat, trust me. But Barry was awesome, and you know, he kind of set the tone for the thing there. And that's when I got the idea that we weren't going to be able to pull the kind of artists, because like Image had just started up too. So a lot of the superstar artists from Marvel had gone and started their own company as well. There wasn't a huge talent pool to choose from, but so I started thinking, well, the really smart thing to do is to get some seasoned veterans in, like Barry Windsor-Smith, like Bob Hall, and stuff like that, and get them to work with talented newcomers and basically have them learn on the job. The old studio systems back in the 50s and the 40s used to be like that. You know, Dick Giordano, my mentor, worked in the studio system for years. You know, Don Perlin, who worked at Valiant, he worked with Will Eisner for years in Will Eisner's studio. But that studio system had fallen by the wayside. You know, I became just like freelancers and every man for himself. So at Valiant, we kind of reinstituted the studio program, where basically, like I said, it was a mix of a young up-and-coming talent and seasoned professionals. And I mean, I hold art classes there on Wednesdays. You know, they at any given time, you know, they could sit at the feet of Barry Windsor-Smith and learn how to draw. You know, I mean, it was a miraculous place in a lot of ways, because there's never been anything like it. And then the fact that we started, you know, making a, you know, ton of money didn't hurt either.
As I recall, a lot of the Valiant properties ended up in other media. I believe, wasn't Turok licensed for a video game, and there was a TV series, I think, on, was it Nightman?
No, you're thinking that was Malibu.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize.
That was another startup company to say, because companies, when the speculator boom happened, it was like 91, 92, when the speculator boom really started. Comic companies were springing up like daffodils, in a field. I mean, they were just boom, or I should say dandelions, because some of them were kind of weedy. But they were just cropping up overnight, and so yeah, there was just a glut of material out there. So but at the same time, we found our audience. Our direction wasn't in glitzy art. It wasn't the image look and flashy kind of stuff. It was more character driven stories that held our readership. So we offered something that the other companies didn't do. The rest of them were more like big art books, and we were still trying to give people stories. But the Turok video game didn't come in until after we were acquired by Acclaim, and they were looking to buy. Originally, they were looking to buy Image, strangely enough, because they felt that Image books were for kind of younger audience and fit their like teenage demographic. But Image, them being rebels, they told them, "Yeah, go, up yours." So what they decided was they were going to acquire us and basically turn us into Image, which I was, of course, opposed to. That's another story for later in this conversation. The main thing, when they came in, they were looking to develop properties. So one of the first things they came to me was they said, "Which one of these things do you think we could turn into a first-person shooter?" And I thought Turok in the Lost Land seemed like natural. Here's a Native American trapped in a land of dinosaurs and high-tech sci-fi. And it's like, you can't make a video game out of that. There's something wrong with you, So he's got guns, bows and arrows. He got the whole 9 yards or whatever. So I wrote the first, draft for the video game. Basically how it would work. I even named the big giant looming monsters Perlins after Uncle Don Perlin, because Don was a big hulking guy, so I named them Perlins. And it turned out to be the best selling game that they ever did. That's not saying a lot. Acclaim, because go find Acclaim now. They were a poorly managed company, but we didn't have a lot of choice selling to them, which you can ask me about later. Or now, whichever you want.
We will go back there, but I do want to get more into, I guess, the role of editor-in-chief. How are you working with those teams? Is it a lot of cajoling to get the books out on time? Is it a lot more of that creative collaboration that you were talking about, where you're having those art classes, or is it just a struggle because you've got to make sure that everything gets done and you're pulling out your hair and
No, we don't work like that. We never did. We had the best on-time record of any comic book company in existence, Marvel, DC, any of them. The first time we ever missed a deadline was because of Joe Quesada, the soon-to-be editor-in-chief of Marvel. Yeah, Joe couldn't make a deadline to save his life. And Ninjak was the first book I put him on, and he was 4 months late of the first issue. Wow. But normally we ran like a really well-oiled machine. I had great people. And again, Professor, sharing a vision is so important, whether you're making films, whether you're making comic books, whatever it is. If dreams are contagious and you want people to follow you, follow that dream, even if they don't necessarily find you to be the most palatable human being in the world, the dream is what's enticing, and everybody there had a voice. We used to have weekly meetings. Everybody would just sit on the floor in a big circle, and that would include the accountants and the people in the mail room and all that kind of stuff. And everybody had an opportunity to talk about the books, talk about the company, talk about how we can make things better, and nobody's voice was silenced. Everyone had a chance. And I think that's one of the reasons why we wound up being the third largest publisher in the North America after Marvel and DC. We actually won first time any independent publisher won Publisher of the Year from Diamond was in '93, was us. Which put the industry on its ear. That was like one of the proudest moments of my life, because it was just like, this is voted by the retailers, and we had basically beat out Marvel and DC, from a measly little startup company. It was pretty nice. So we never had problem with deadlines because everyone knew their job, and people would jump in and help everybody else get the job done. I mean, not that we didn't burn the midnight oil. We burned it a lot of times. But the point is, everybody there understood what needed to be done. So we never missed a deadline.
The comic industry seems to have changed. Everything seems to be, the artists don't talk to the writers. They just get a script. They just, do art that might not be the best storytelling. So in your opinion, 20 years from, or 25 years from the Valiant days, what really signaled that shift between the collaborative model and sort of this, hey, everyone does their own parts and is a specialist?
I'll tell you exactly what happened. After I got out, I retired in 1996. I got out of comics. After we had sold the company and Acclaim started running Valiant into the ground, I saw the writing on the wall. I also argued for years with my business partners, Steve Mazarski and John Hartz. The three of us were, equity partners in the company. And I said, you can't sell more than 500,000 copies of any book. If you do that, it's going to collapse, because there's not the maximum amount of readers at that particular time, from all our estimates, was about 500,000. I said, you really can't sell any more than that without risking imploding the market. And then Turok 1 came out, 1.7 million orders, 1.7 million, and greed's a bitch. Greed will get you, and they went with it, and that and just the death of Superman and all the other stuff out there where they were just they printed like 7 million copies of Death of Superman or whatever. And I just kind of knew the writing was on the wall. I'd seen what happened with the trading card industry, where speculators had come in and bought cases of books, unopened cases of books, and putting them away thinking they're going to flip them when the time's right. Well, I'm not sure what precipitated it, but I'd already been out of the business, but I'm not sure which thing precipitated it, but they started dumping all their books for pennies on the dollars, and the collector market just went belly up. By 2000, Marvel was in bankruptcy, okay? They had made a lot of bad business decisions, and they had tried their own distribution at one point, getting incredibly greedy, and as a result, the whole house of cards came tumbling down. So when I had left for about 6 years, I was out of the business altogether. I moved down here to Florida and bought a boat and a dog, but I was bored out of my skull. And then my mentor, Dick Giordano, who had moved down here as well, said, well, why don't we just go back and do some stuff together? We never got a chance to work together. He trained me, and whenever I was working at Marvel, he was at DC, and he's so forth and so on. So we never had a chance to actually sit down and do anything together. So it was around 2001 that I said, well, yeah, I'll come back. And at that time, I already saw the writing on the wall. What had happened was the numbers had just shrunk terribly. And what they had decided to do was play to their base. That there was a base of hardcore readers who basically would buy any Marvel comic or any DC comic. And I always equated it to, imagine Star Trek movies written by Star Trek fans. They would be indecipherable to normal human beings, okay? The people on the street. So we used to write comics for mass market, for newsstand. Like we talked about in the last episode, every issue was a first issue. That's the way we put things out. That got lost into large continuity and to large what I would call decompressed storylines because they could make more money doing a 12-issue story they could compile into a trade paperback and then sell it again since the art and editorial was done. So the trade paperback was a way to recoup losses, so that's kind of everything started turning into that. Now I can see your brain working, that you pretty much know what I'm talking about, right? And all the guys who had worked in the business before, who knew what they were doing, had already either gotten out or got fed up with the system because you didn't have the kind of people there that knew, like the Archie Goodwins and the Denny O'Neills and those kind of guys who knew what they're doing. You basically had interns who were editors now, and I think in a lot of cases, especially with Dick and I, we were both heads of major publishers before. So there was a little intimidation factor and some resentment for authority too. So it was a little tough getting work, But I endeavored for a while, and I realized that the writing was on the wall to some degree, okay? Because having been a businessman, it is an unsustainable business model. So by 2007, I had just gotten out of the business altogether because I basically I went out to Hollywood, like we talked about, and started working with Marvel Studios and with other production companies out there because I saw that as where all this was going, And it's true. You look at it now. Remember when you were a kid, or I don't know how old you are, Terrence, but when I was a kid, you go to the drugstore, you go to the supermarket, or you go to the newsstand, and there's the spinner rack, and you pick up a comic book and take it home. It was so easy to get. And that was the jumping on point to reading Arthur C. Clarke or reading, real books in a lot of ways. I mean, it was that if you were a science fiction or a fantasy junkie, this was the start. This was the entryway to that, comic books, and now that paradigm has shifted, and now the CW is like where people get is the entryway. The CW, the motion pictures. When I do Comic Cons, over 50% of the people attending those shows have never read a comic book in their life. They're there because they love Arrow, or they love the Avengers, or they love the Justice League or Wonder Woman. They're there because that was their entry point now. Because comics are no longer accessible to a mass market like they were, and they're not even written for a mass market, and that's part of the problem. That's that and the fact that the price of them keeps going up.
It is interesting.
It's an unsustainable business model.
I was going to say, DC and Marvel always seem to have a new number one to try and drum up some sales, but the one thing they seem to lack is a way to get that new audience in.
They're not drumming up sales. They're trying to bring back the people who have left. It's like because the numbers keep dwindling, so they keep coming up with some sort of event or gimmick or something that will get people to draw them back in. Hey, we're going to reboot the line again for the Marvel. Isn't Marvel rebooting their line once more?
Yes, they are.
Wow. I rest my case. But that's not because they're going to bring in a whole bunch of new readers. They're trying to keep the ones they have. They're trying to bring back the ones they've lost. But as far as anybody doing anything to bring people in, they're not. I mean, if I was the king of comic books, okay, which I'm not, but let's just say there was one, all right? I mean, my first edict would be to have every one of those characters that have a motion picture echo that motion picture. Who cares about your continuity? Who cares about anything else? You got an audience of millions out there. Oh, well, Black Panther is going to hit $1 billion next week or something? And does Marvel even publish a Black Panther comic? I'm pretty sure. I don't know if they do or not. But I wouldn't know because I would follow that stuff. But what I'm saying is I make darn sure that the Black Panther comic was exactly like the movie, because then you're going to get some fallout that way, because the biggest problem has been, even when you get people who love the X-Men, they went and saw X-Men First Class. Oh my God, I loved X-Men First Class. I want to get a comic book. I want more of it. Well, how do I get a comic book? Well, when I was a kid, I just got them anywhere. Where do I get one now? Well, I look up online. There's It's a comic shop. I have to get in my car and I have to drive to buy this little 22-page pamphlet, which now, you know, when I was a kid cost 50 cents and now it's $5, you know? And it's like, and I have to get in my car and drive there. And, you know, and like I said, and not all comic shops are created equal, as you know, my friend, too, you know? I mean, there are some really great shops, and then there are some that are kind of smelly, like a porn store or something, you know? And so there's no consistency to the outlet, retail outlet as well. But they go and they pick up the comic, and they're not the same characters. They don't look the same. They're not even introduced in some cases. I've read recent Marvel comics by accident. Somebody would give me some to draw in or something like that, like a blank cover or something. And I've gone through it, and there's this guy talking, and through the entire book, they don't introduce him by name. There's a presumption that you've read every single one, and you would know who this guy is. Well, that's not how you reach a mass audience. I mean, my mom, like I said, is 92 years old now. But when Iron Man came out, she was able to sit down and actually watch. She'd never read one of my comics in her life. But the movie made sense to her, you know? It's like, so, you know, ask your mom what makes sense. You want to know if a comic makes sense or not, give it to your mom to read, you know? But that's part of the problem. The problem is because of the speculator collapse and the collapse of collectability of comics, it's like that's become the issue. So you don't have a product that appeals to a mass audience.
Well, Bob, they're telling me that we are out of time, which is, again, amazing.
Are you kidding?
So I want to thank you so much for speaking with us again
I'll be
today.
back next week.
Let's hope so. I'd like to thank you at home for watching Comic Culture. We'll see you again soon.